welcome to another show for Friday, Reverse CSI with David Hawkins. I'm in a remote location today, so we're going to be doing just a telephone call-in so we can keep continuous quality in your voice. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Well, it's good to see even a still picture of you, David. We're going to be talking today about some really important topics. And, you know, David, people who have been watching us on patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and of course your channel, patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, know very well that every Friday you and I are doing a special double header, sort of. We've got our normal show here on YouTube and Periscope and Facebook and all the other channels that we utilize, but we also have a subscriber-only show that's available only to the sponsors of the show who watch on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. But what we've decided to do today, because it's the last day of the month and we want as many people as possible to see the information and to share it with friends, hopefully to expand the base of sponsors, we're going to be doing the whole show here for everyone to watch on YouTube and Periscope and all the free platforms. And another reason why we wanted to do that, David, is that we're going to be covering some extremely important information today. And this latest incident that just occurred in Sri Lanka has a component of the stifling of free speech in social media. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that's right. The Sri Lanka authorities, they shut down or tried to shut down a whole bunch of social media during the attacks. To a certain extent, I think that was paralleled with what the New Zealand government did in the attack on that mosque. It seems that they're very frightened of what they think are rumors or fake news that might circulate under social media, but of course that preempts the ability of the average person to get in maybe as a witness to actually what happened. So shutting down on free speech is very important, and I think the technique that they're using is this tunneling system that you and I have been discussing at great length. And on your wonderful collage, as usual, we've got a metaphor there. We've drawn, or we've created, the three tunnels, which serve three different categories using the time division multiplex split tunneling invention that allows you to create three communities built around the data from a crime scene. So on the left-hand side, you have what I would call the red team, led by this Mr. Swigart, who's actually had a very interesting career. I mean, he describes himself as an ethical hacker. I've got a lot of question marks about what an ethical hacker is. And the point is, this man has worked for some interesting organizations, including the NSA. He's worked for Booz, Allen and Hamilton. And Booz, Allen and Hamilton is this sort of conglomerate consultancy outfit that offers services that they call a top-off exercise service. That is a top official exercise where they borrow the networks of the government or the host or the client, and they introduce into that government-controlled network a fake attack, if you will, with a point, just like Serco in the United Kingdom, trying to see if the government officials respond correctly and adequately and in a timely manner and an appropriate manner to a fake attack. And of course, the danger is, of course, particularly if Booz Allen and Hamilton is being hacked by its consultant, even if he's wearing the label ethical hacker, he may inadvertently leave a backdoor into Booz Allen and Hamilton, and let's say a continuity of government exercise, as was the case on 911, gets switched through various technologies, let's say Boeing AWACS weapons directors, from a simulated attack to a live fire, which is what happened on 911. Yeah. And Serco provides a very similar service to the United Kingdom government. So it's extremely dangerous when this, I think you've illustrated him in a pimp outfit. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that before we go on.
Well, this is just, you know, the red...
tongue-in-cheek, or is that...
He's the red team leader, and I'm looking around for various red outfits. You know, as an author and a daily commenter on social media, Mr. Swigart is a limited-purpose public figure, and by the legal definition of that, he's inserted himself into this public discourse. So certainly him trying to stop us from making political cartoons, photo illustrations, you know, this is this is what happens when you're a public figure. You know, certainly Donald Trump may not like some of the less flattering images that newspapers around the world create of him, or any public figure may not, but this is freedom of speech, this is public commentary, and you know, David, you and I have spoken quite a bit about the lawsuit from Robert David Steele, which Mr. Swigert is very aggressively trying to intervene in. He's got his own lawsuits against me in other jurisdictions, but it's interesting to see how these incidents, first in New Zealand, then, you know, we've on Crowdsource the Truth with other guests have analyzed that video created by Brendan Tarrant and the evidence contained within, the reaction of the New Zealand government in terms of clamping down on social media, making it illegal to even view that video, and now the reaction to what's gone on in Sri Lanka. There were a number of articles. The New York Times had an article about how they think that you know, you should shut down social media because it introduces, in their view, dangerous fake news. Meanwhile, you know, the mainstream news has been telling us for 2 years that Donald Trump was a Russian agent working with the Russians. That seems to be fake. So there's an incredible push, you know, to sort of shut down any commentary that's not officially approved. You know, David, I think a lot of people would agree that what we've heard about 9/11 for almost 18 years has been fake news. So it's an interesting move on the part of all these governments to try to stop social media from being a resource, and the same thing is happening to Crowdsource the Truth.
And it's also interesting if those governments actually employ people who are experts in social media to engineer a perception in the public that actually they're not involved in some of these attacks. Now, excuse me, immediately above the left-hand tunnel, we've got this woman wearing, I'm not quite sure what the significance of that hat is, but it is a red hat. Now, this woman is a very interesting, her name is Maureen Baginski, and she's a Russian language and Russian cultural affairs expert. But more important, the National Security Agency, I think she reached the position of third in command, very senior position, and she was responsible for a little meeting of people from the NSA, about 50 of them, in a meeting a few weeks after 9/11. And she said the most mind-numbingly horrific thing. She said to the people from the NSA, and apparently they were appalled, and legitimately so, she said 9/11 is a gift to NSA because we're going to get all the money we want.
Yeah.
Now, when did she, I wonder, start getting the motivation that maybe 911 might be a good idea in advance, because that would bring more funds into NSA, ultimately to turn NSA into a surveillance arm for the worst kind of forces within the American or the Five Eyes countries. But the point is, Mr. Swigert had worked for 2 years as a consultant or a contractor to the NSA, as far as I know, during the period when she occupied the senior, senior position in the NSA. So my question is, did Swigert actually engineer this split tunnel technology in a joint venture with Maureen Baginski at the NSA, where the data, the time-stamped and the location-stamped data from a crime scene, such as 911 or previous crimes like the East African Embassy bombings or the USS Cole, where the data needed by the investigators to solve the crime is actually siphoned or split into 3 channels, where the time-stamped and the location stamp of that data is not available to the police or the investigator. So, for example, when John O'Neill goes out to Aden to investigate the bombing of the USS Cole, which I believe was ambushed, right, he comes back and he doesn't get the cooperation of the Aden authorities or the people in the heart. I believe the U.S. ambassador, I can't remember her name, blocked him at every turn, and he came back, and basically the FBI was left helpless and unable to solve what was really a very simple crime in the case of the USS Cole, because the USS Cole got a signal sent to the bridge. I believe that came through Maxar Technologies. Back then it was called McDonnell Detweiler, through the Marine Corps International Intelligence Network. The USS Cole got a command to, instead of having an underway replenishment, I think they call it unrep at sea, it was told to go into Aden Harbor and dock. And you know what? The bumper sub against which it's docked appears to have been full of explosives. So they actually sent the USS Cole into Aden Harbor. It killed about 10 sailors, I believe. The docking was about a few meters away from the magazine. Had it hit the magazine, then that ship would not exist anymore, and everyone on board would have been killed. The whole thing would have been blown sky high.
And David, the magazine is the area of the ship where munitions are stored or fuel is stored?
Yeah, that's where the explosives are. And I think that was the intent, but they didn't quite position it correctly.
Right.
Just like they didn't quite position the timing of the announcement that building number 7 had come down.
I mean, that would have certainly been dramatic for the entire ship to explode with all the munitions in it.
Oh, it would have been dramatic, and of course, the ability to go through the little bits of evidence and find out what happened would have been hindered anyway. But the mere fact of stripping out the timestamp and the location stamp of the data or the signals for that to be detonated meant that the FBI and related organizations, including the U.S. Secret Service, they were unable to investigate that crime. And of course, when you don't investigate a crime, and the weather underground leaders understand that very well, these people are empowered, right? Yeah. So they look for increasing ways of getting into a crime scene early, scripting the crime scene, making sure that the data that would allow you to reverse engineer the crime scene by putting cause before effect does not fall into the hands of the investigators, and then you give it to people like the evil teachers, if you will, and a radicalized student community that's networked through EduRoam. So these people can actually engage in what is known as dead pool betting, using, let's say, patterns of the type developed by Howard Lutnick, the chief executive officer of Cantor Fitzgerald at the top of the North Tower, who was conveniently out of the building on the morning of 9/11, leaving his brother and 685 of his working colleagues to be obliterated. I mean, this man is a scumbag.
Yeah.
Right? And he's a great friend of Jeffrey Epstein.
Oh,
right? In fact,
I didn't know that.
They have their two mansions side by side in New York.
Howard Lutnick
now, as we know.
Jeffrey Epstein.
Sorry?
Howard Lutnick and Jeffrey Epstein.
That's right, that's right. So coming back to this wonderful graphic that you've done, the collage, as we call it, you've got Maureen Baginski, who says 911 is a gift to the NSA, disgusting 50 of her senior colleagues. And then her career is very interesting because after leaving the NSA, she gets a gig with Robert Mueller's FBI from 2003 to 2005, where she becomes the intelligence director for the FBI, who develops, this is according to the media, the FBI's first intelligence network. I mean, excuse me, you mean, are we meant to believe that the FBI doesn't have any intelligence networks? Or are we basically understanding that she introduced a means of networking the FBI with intelligence so that it could never solve any crime ever again? Right? Now, the problem with, in the background behind, you have Christine Marcy. Right? Now, Christine Marcy is the sister of my former colleague, Field McConnell, when he and I were trying to work constructively on, solving crime through able danger, and that seems to have gone by the wayside. But returning to Christine Marcy, she was the founder of I believe, the National National Center for Missing and Exploited Children database in 1984, 1985. She bought the first Boeing 737, I think, for what would become JPATS or Con Air, with money I think she stole from the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund. So you've ended up now with a woman who then migrated through various channels, and on 911 she was the chief operating officer of the Small Business Administration, with basically signature authority over, I think, about $50 billion of loans granted to small business, including protege companies with Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon. So, of course, what you have on 911 is you have a whole bunch of small companies of dubious loyalty. Now, am I being rude here? I don't know. I'm just saying that the awards of a loan guarantee to a small business protege company are based on the extent to which the owners are disadvantaged by virtue of their sexual orientation, ethnicity, or whatever. So if they are, let's say, Indian American or whatever, then they get grants as protege companies of Boeing, and Boeing is obliged to give them a subset or a set-aside from these major contracts. So you can see the Federal Bridge, as we understand it, and I think to all intents and purposes, the Federal Bridge was implemented by McDonnell Detweiler after Entrust was spun out of Nortel. Now, Nortel, of course, was this extraordinary company where the shares were pumped up, I think, to $120 and then pumped down again. A massive pump and dump fraud. About 4,000 or 5,000 patents that Nortel had, including a bunch of very important revocation patents. And Mr. Swigart will know exactly what we mean by revocation patents, because what that means is if you have a Federal Bridge network like this, then Protocol X509, I think it is, which was introduced in 1988, allows you to issue certificates and revoke certificates. So right in the middle of a game, a war game or an exercise, like 911, a continuity of government exercise, a whole bunch of blue teams, which are the good guys, had their certificates revoked. Effectively, they were stood down. The red team, led, I don't know, from a software point of view or a cryptographic point of view by someone like Swigart, and from a military point of view, let's say, by a couple of generals. They're both dead now, but so they should be, because I think they betrayed the United States on 9/11. You have General Alexander Haig, who's one of the CAI private equity, private investors in McDonnell Detweiler and Maxar. Now, he's the former Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, and Serco has a seriously large logistics base in Luxembourg. Now, in Luxembourg, as I understand it, you have this guy, David Swigart, doing something in Luxembourg, but I think he had a superb opportunity, actually, to build a back door into the logistics of NATO that could potentially allow them to deploy a Boeing AWACS aircraft over the United States, perhaps refueled over the Atlantic, over, let's say, New York and Washington, to do this extraordinary switch using a patented system. I think they call it the Interactive Training System for Boeing AWACS weapons directors. And what that allows you to do is to, through the Boeing AWACS system, provide courseware for trainees, and then simulation, where you actually get an exercise simulated. And then, Jason, you can switch to live fire, which is what happened on 9/11. Yeah. The Boeing AWACS aircraft over Washington and New York was switched from simulation to live fire. And I would like to know what Mr. Swigart believes were the vulnerabilities, or for that matter, Maureen Baginski, the vulnerabilities that might have been exploited by the people responsible for the 9/11 attack in inducing or triggering the switch from simulation to live fire, which is what 3,000 people who died on 9/11 encountered. Over to you.
Yeah, and we've spoken in past shows, David, about how upset Mr. Swigart gets when his brother has mentioned the NATO generals in Luxembourg. So I don't know what went on there, but you raise a lot of interesting points. This woman, Maureen Baginski, so you've asked about the hat. It's a hat that I chose to put on her, you know, because she's on the red team. There's this whole red team, blue team analogy going on. And of course, because of her incredibly distasteful comment of 9/11 being a gift, I've placed the World Trade Center here inside this gift box. And, you know, David, it occurs to me, we've heard a lot about how, you know, the movie Rain Man was maybe the first sort of mainstream film to address this, but there's a lot of people that suffer from autism or Asperger's syndrome, some of these various neurological, I don't even know how you'd categorize these things, but seems that extreme intelligence or genius is often associated with these types of, I guess in the old days they would call these people savants or something like that, where perhaps someone has a very high degree of intelligence in a particular area, computers, mathematics, cryptography, or whatever, and it's often at the expense of social interactions and things like empathy and whatever. So for someone to make a comment that is so idiotic and so devoid of any empathy, sympathy, anything that a normal person would have for the thousands of people who were killed on September 11th and the subsequent, decades-long wars that have gone on, to say that it was a gift because you're going to get money from it is absolutely borderline psychopathic. So it gives us some insight into this woman's thinking. And I forget the guy's name. There was someone quoted as having witnessed that comment, an NSA employee.
Mr. Binney was.
Well, I don't know if I didn't see that Bill Binney witnessed it. I wanted to call Bill and ask him about it. But one of the guys that I know that Bill had been sort of under fire with, who was part of Bill Binney's Thin Thread team, I forget his last name, Thomas something or something Thomas, but he witnessed the comment. So, these were guys who were well aware that there was something very wrong going on at NSA, and perhaps Maureen Baginski is one of those somethings that's very wrong. And who knows what a person might do. I mean, we're not trying to say that she's evil. We're just stating that this is a comment that she made. This gives us insight into her thought process and what exactly is it that she thinks her goals are. I would hope these agencies are dedicated to protecting the citizens of the United States. And when an incident occurs that results in 3,000 of us being killed, they would think that that's anything but a gift. Perhaps we should move, David, to this Sri Lanka incident and some of the information that's coming out about that, and take us through some more of the collage here.
Okay, so certainly, we've got this wonderful plane, sort of Red Baron type plane, dragging a banner of EduRoam. Now, I've been looking at EduRoam in terms of its vulnerability to hacking. And apparently this is a facility funded by the European Union, which may or may not have the best interests of the United States at heart. I would suggest there are forces within the European Union that very much are polarized against the United States, just like we have in Canada, in Quebec, where, I think the Americans would be very naive to believe that most of Canada is standing behind it, particularly in that 9/11 attack. But EduRoam apparently is very vulnerable to hacking, and there's a facility called CRACK, K-R-A-C-K. I forget what the acronym stands for. But EduRoam basically offers students and faculty a global Wi-Fi hotpoint capability. So if they belong to a member university of EduRoam, they can go to any other university in the world. Let's say the University of, I think it's Christchurch, Canterbury, or University of Canterbury in Christchurch, one of those two, which is a member of EduRoam. And basically, then you have this hotpoint, which allows you, I think, a very high bandwidth communication with other people on that global network. So if I wanted to recruit a latter-day Weather Underground organization from within the universities, well, why wouldn't I go, for example, to that guy, whoever he was, who was educated in the United Kingdom? He didn't get a degree, but he goes to Australia and gets a PhD, and he was apparently one of the bombers or suicide bombers or organizers of the attack in Sri Lanka. Why wouldn't I recruit a guy like that? Obviously, you've got to entrap him in some way, or maybe bribe him or groom him into, the belief that after the shooting at the mosque in New Zealand, then the least he can do is blow up a few people in the church in Sri Lanka. And the point here is, you see, if we are right in thinking that you have evil teachers networked through EduRoam that can deploy radical killer groups, they don't really care whether the Christians are the targets or the Muslims are the target. What they want is to set the Christians against the Muslims and the Muslims against the Christians and drive religion out of everyday discourse. These people are a-religious. I'm not sure that's the right term. What is it? Karl Marx said religion is the opiate of the poor. Well, people, I think some people would say if you believe in nothing, you believe in anything. There's a terrible poverty in the minds of people like Bill and Hillary Clinton and Barack and Michelle Obama and and the Weather Underground, Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn. But the point is, they're extremely dangerous people, in my opinion, because they're sociopaths. They don't believe in any of the things the average American believes, family, trust, love, affection, loyalty, etc. If the woman who's really a senior person in the NSA can then migrate into the FBI, and she's now, Jason, the Vice President of Intelligence Services for Serco.
Yeah, that's shocking, I think, for a lot of people to hear.
It's totally shocking, because Serco runs the United States Patent and Trademark Office, right? It runs the Defense Ammunition Center, about 60 FAA contract towers, and it runs the National Visa Center, and it's all over the intelligence groups within the United States. So everything Serco does is potentially suspect, because they can hack into any of these networks and create a false flag, or in the United Kingdom they call it a resilience network, where they borrow a government's or client government's network, create a virtual story or a virtual terrorist group or whatever within the target organization, stage, for example, the London Underground bombing, and they can be doing it with the alibi that they're trying to test public servants to see if they respond appropriately to an emergency.
Right.
But if they can switch from a virtual or simulated emergency to a real one, 99% of the people participating in the exercise, basically they're left sucking air, if you will.
Well, they have no idea what's going on. Yeah.
No, but they've been deployed and they're compromised because they're standing on the Pentagon lawn in the middle of an exercise, and they've been told to pick up the evidence on the Pentagon lawn and take it away, right? So now, again, you're coming back to the situation where the investigative body, which we think of as the FBI, or the United States Secret Service, is deprived of the data that is date-stamped and location-stamped, such that they can't re-engineer or recreate the crime scene before the crime happened. And this is where you and I come in, because I think now, and I hope our listeners understand whether the breadth of or depth of our ambition is clear. What I want to be able to do, and I believe we can do, is borrow the technology that they use quite possibly to execute a crime, and I would call that the Electronic Visualization Lab, Bright Advanced Technology, and the CAVE Automated Virtual Reality environment, and the EduRoam, and help students engage in the evil Batcave and reverse engineer the theories, the prejudices, and the dogma of their teachers. For example, I can tell you with 100% honesty, even though I'm not a meteorologist, climate change driven by catastrophic anthropogenic global warming is a hoax, right? And if we could put students inside one of these facilities and just use some of the ground data, for example, the cross plots of against time of carbon dioxide and temperature over geochronological time going back 600 million years, or more recent, with the precession of the equinoxes, you'll see, for example, that carbon dioxide follows peaks of temperature by 800 years. It doesn't lead peaks of temperature, right? It's not a global warming gas. It's a slight insulator. And when carbon dioxide in the surface of the ocean, or the first 1 foot of the ocean, when the ocean is heated, the solubility of the carbon dioxide is decreased. The carbon dioxide comes out of solution into the atmosphere, and you get a peak of carbon dioxide 800 years after you've got a peak in temperature.
Now, David, sorry for interrupting, but let me take you back to the Sri Lanka thing, because I want to keep you focused on that. There's so much still coming out about that, and this was such a horrendous attack. I think it's interesting how you point out that it's almost like this game of ping pong where it's, from New Zealand we had allegedly a white supremacist attacking Muslims. Now we've got an attack on Christians here with the church attack in Sri Lanka. Now, is Sri Lanka primarily a Muslim country?
I think there's about 11% of Christians.
Mm-hmm. So they're a minority there, obviously.
Yes.
But yes, that's quite interesting. And, there was a video put out just a few days ago, David. I don't know if you're familiar with this YouTuber, Amazing Polly, but she's definitely amazing. She's doing some amazing work. I mean, she seems to be just an independent citizen producing YouTube videos, similar to what you and I do. And, this is exactly what I believe they're trying to shut down with things like the New Zealand mosque shooting. I mean, in addition to the deaths that occurred, there was that secondary mosque that we saw no video from. There was this really questionable video that came out that seemed almost like a bug zapper, almost like a honey trap for independent social media sleuths who have been putting out information about these types of events for many, many years. So I hope people will go to Amazing Polly's channel. I don't know her. I haven't spoken with her. I'm going to give her video a thumbs up because I really liked it. But I wanted you to hear a little bit of what she's talking about, David, because it's got a lot to do with what we're talking about. She's been tracking members of the Cabal, an international network, right? And well, let me just play a bit of it for you here. She's talking about Samantha Power giving a speech in Sri Lanka in February honoring this guy, Mangala.
First of all, she was in Sri Lanka on February 28, 2019 to honor this guy, Mangala Samarawira. She was delivering the keynote address at an event to mark this finance minister's completion of 30 years in politics. First of all, I gotta say, she's no longer a UN ambassador.
Well, people can watch.
She's not in the...
People can watch Amazing Polly's video to get all of the information. But the things that really are the high points in that video that stood out to me, David, relative to what you and I talk about, is there's a whole connection to Marxism. This guy joined hands with a woman during his rise to politics, a woman who created a grassroots campaign after her son was kidnapped, and it was all about finding missing children and kidnapped men, and that politician linked to that. Samantha Powers goes to Sri Lanka. There's this attack in Sri Lanka. We've spoken about how Michelle Obama was on the Seine having some, luxury cruise while Notre Dame burned. I apologize, David. I forgot to include Notre Dame in the collage. We should have had that in there as well. But I mean, there's so much to include in each of these. There's this ongoing sort of pattern. We had John Podesta showed up in New Zealand to warn them that their elections were ripe for hacking just before the New Zealand shooting occurred. And in each of these events, there is a move to shut down social media, just like there's a move to shut down what you and I are doing here on Crowdsource the Truth and with David Hawkins' Reverse CSI. They don't want information coming out that is not information controlled by them. And I thought it was very interesting that I saw this article in the New York Times. The New York Times believes they have freedom of speech, but you and I should not. And Mr. Swigert is taking part aggressively, I must say, in these lawsuits that are intended to shut down my channel, shut me down financially, get me implicated in crimes that I haven't committed, and basically do all sorts of things to prevent Crowdsource the Truth from moving forward. So I want people to understand what's going on here. We aren't making these videos to make fun of David Swigert. We're trying to point out real questions about what these people are doing. I didn't know David Swigert when I started making videos on YouTube, but it seems that the information that I've brought forward has attracted his attention to me and to you, David, to try to malign us, to try to spread lies. He's doubted that you've been to Cambridge. You've shown me the diplomas, and obviously you've achieved all of these things. So it's interesting that they're taking this aggressive stance and trying to shut us down at the same time that this larger international cabal, perhaps it's a small foreign faction. Would you say that that's accurate, David?
It's a small global intellectual elite. Just when Rockefeller said that the world is ready to move to a supranational government of world bankers and an intellectual elite, I think that's a very precise description. The world bankers, and then maybe you can just go back to the collage and just zoom in on the North Tower of the World Trade Center, which was the first to be impacted. Now, the most important thing about this is on the 47th floor, I think it was hit between the 80th and the 90th floors, and no one survived above the point of impact. And I think that was very important to the conspirators. But down on the 47th floor, the chief executive officer of Serco left the windows of the World breakfast meeting arranged by a British insurance publishing house called Risk Waters. He must have got in the elevator at about, I would say, 8:30 in the morning of September the 11th. He goes down to the 47th floor to meet with Serco shareholders. Serco shareholders, and this is vitally important, and I would say this is a challenge for Robert Mueller to explain himself, because to the best of my knowledge, the FBI never investigated the people who showed up at the shareholders meeting on the 47th floor, and they should have done, for a number of reasons. One of those shareholders is the government of Saudi Arabia.
Robert Mueller's very good at not investigating what he should be investigating and investigating things that have nothing to do with what the actual problem is.
Right, correct. Another government, of course, is the United Kingdom government, which has had a history of close association with the United States government, especially involving the Patent Office that goes back at least to World War I. But what intrigues me is the Tizard mission of September 1940. The British, courtesy, I believe, of Victor Rothschild, the right-hand man of Winston Churchill, sent the Tizard mission to the United States because they needed, with all of these bright ideas and technologies they had, they needed to ramp up the production capability. So the British brought to the United States the cavity magnetron technology, the proximity fuse, right, the radar systems and technology, the calculations for the plutonium bomb, and friend or foe swapping technology, because the British, when the Germans or Luftwaffe left off for a bombing raid, they needed to distinguish between friend or foe to make sure that they deployed the RAF with the maximum effectiveness. So those technologies were brought over to the United States, and the Tizard mission and advisors sat down with senior military people in the United States and major industrial figures. And this maybe is something where perhaps Mr. Swigert can pay attention to understand that we're not against him and we're not against his father, who is a veteran, very inventive, capable guy who I believe invented the cordless telephone. But anyway, at the Tizard mission, on the other side of the table, negotiating an extremely lucrative production arrangement using this technology was Radio Corporation of America, David Sarnoff. Right? Now, Radio Corporation of America, David Sarnoff, had a subsidiary, a wholly owned subsidiary in the United Kingdom called RCAGB 1929. Right? Obviously, it created in 1929. And RCAGB 1929 got the contract with the British government to provide a 4-minute warning service to the British peasants. Right? And what I believe would happen is that the elites in the United Kingdom would get the 4-minute warning so they could retreat into the basement of their luxury hotels or whatever, but the peasants would get fried. Perhaps I digress. In 1988, RCAGB had a management buyout that got converted into an IPO by its investment advisor, N.M. Rothschild & Sons, for the which Mr. Wilbur Ross was working for at least 25 years, and certainly during that period of 1988 to 1989, and he had a number of projects on his books, so he's obviously a fairly capable guy, because he was challenged to prevent President Trump from going into bankruptcy. Apparently, Trump owed $4 billion or something crazy, because no one invested in Trump. They lent him money because they figured they'd eventually get it back, and of course, if you can get a man into the White House, there's quite a good opportunity of getting paid back. But going back to the World War II, of course, so you then end up with, I don't know if it's a marriage made in hell or whatever. You got the United States Patent and Trademark Office, which is now run by Serco, effectively, and the British Patent Office developing patents that I believe is the core of this split tunnel technology, where you can take any crime scene anywhere, anytime. You can route the data away from the police, right, so that they can't actually solve the crime. You can take the time-stamped and location-stamped data and give it to the evil teachers so they can engage in what is known as death pool betting. Now, if people believe that death pool betting doesn't exist, I would point out that White's Club of London, which was founded in 1692, in their betting book, dated an entry, I think, dated 1811 or 1815, there's an entry of a couple of lords betting against each other, which says something to the effect that if any Chinaman dies in the affair of Her Majesty's ship Celeste, then Captain Maxwell will die. So these people have been betting on death for hundreds of years, right? And you can make a great deal of money on making sure that the people that you're betting will die, do die, when you want them to die. Now, you put that in the hands of a corrupt faculty and students that are being led by the nose into believing that the most important thing they can possibly do is prevent people from breathing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. You've got yourself a serious enemy. Over to you.
Right, and it brings me back to a couple of other points that you've raised throughout the time that we've been doing these shows. You've spoken about this patent that the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, one of the companies that was destroyed on 9/11, this is a real-time interactive wagering on event outcomes, Howard Lutnick. So that's interesting when you view that these systems and methods for real-time interactive wagering on event outcomes. I mean, that sounds pretty vague, but it definitely would be something that could be utilized in a death pool type betting scenario. David, you've spoken to us about how this would come into play on 9/11. People may be wondering why I've chosen to include this image of the Mandalay Bay, the Luxor. Obviously this has got to do with the mass casualty event of the October 1st shooting in Las Vegas. Another one of these, terrorist/criminal events designed to kill people, which fits in line with the Weather Underground, undermine the security and the peace of the people in the United States, and maybe create discord among. There was a rumor that Stephen Paddock had converted to Islam. There was ISIS had claimed credit for it. But the reason why I chose to include this, David, is because my mind was blown once again when you told me that General Alexander Haig had been an investor in MGM Entertainment. Isn't that correct?
Well, he's a director of MGM Mirage. I think he resigned as a director. I think he died around 2010. But so this guy wore multiple hats. He was Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, prior to, I think, joining the Reagan administration as Secretary of Defense. He was the guy when Reagan was shot said, "I'm in charge here." And he pretends, well, I don't know, he said that he didn't really mean he was taking over the government, but it showed that he was fairly ambitious, right? The point is, going back to Supreme Allied Commander Europe, just running the clock back, at the end of the Second World War, Victor Rothschild was sent to Paris, and he negotiated or grandfathered or coordinated the transformation of the OSS, which grew out of the Special Operations Executive, into the CIA. And the British then kicked in with Operation Paperclip and sent a whole bunch of Nazi concentration camp commanders and propagandists into the United States under Operation Paperclip, where basically their real record in the Second World War, which might include torturing Jews, etc., was bleached, and their record was adjusted such that they could enter the United States legally and perhaps contribute to the rocket program.
Well,
and I'm not
David,
saying again...
Sorry to interrupt, but that takes us once again back to the collage, because standing next to General Haig is, of course, John Shalikashvili, who was the son of a Waffen-SS agent. Did he enter the United States through Operation Paperclip?
Yeah, I believe Dmitry Shalikashvili was a Waffen-SS major, greatly admired by his son, John Shalikashvili, who was the first non-American to end up as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who was sent by Bill Clinton, one of the evil teachers, I allege, to Beijing to give a presentation to the People's Liberation Army generals. This is in 1997 at the Military University in Beijing. And Shalikashvili, in the transcript of his speech, towards the end of it, says something to the effect that I have been instructed by my president, that's Bill Clinton, to leave behind details of all America's weapons programs. Well, Americans, wake up. I mean, this is the President of the United States, Bill Clinton, instructing the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, an immensely influential guy, to go to China and hand over Americans' weapons secrets. So it's hardly surprising now America and is running potentially into World War III against a country with 1.2 billion population that is devoting enormous resources to exploiting American technology and converting it into a weapon. Now, when Shalikashvili comes back into the United States, he gets his next gig is a director of Boeing, right? So it would appear that he extorts Boeing directors, naive or otherwise, into moving the headquarters of the company from Washington State, near the production facility, into Chicago, right? And in Chicago, of course, the Boeing headquarters was commissioned, as I understand it, on the 4th of September 2001. And I think you know what else happened on the 4th of September 2001.
Yes. Robert Mueller became the director of the FBI. So there's all these coincidences surrounding this stuff, David. It's amazing. I mean, people claim that we're saying things without evidence, but all of these are elements of evidence. Now, they're circumstantial evidence. We don't have a recording of Bill Ayers and Barack Obama and Bill Clinton getting together and planning 9/11, but we're pointing out these things that, David, I don't think anyone else has made the types of connections that you're making. While we're on the subject of Chicago, I want to talk about this company that came up in our conversation earlier in the week that surprised me yet again. This company that was called DigiStamp that now seems to be called E-Timestamp, that this came up in one of our Google searches of some of the work that was happening with public key infrastructure. How did we come to this company, and what's the significance of this company?
Well, I think that comes back through Zweigart's period in Luxembourg, where he was working with that company. What's it called?
Eurosign card?
Eurosign, that's it, right? Now, that's a facility that's been retained, I think, by the European Union to develop public key infrastructure in the European Union. My understanding is that that would have given people like Zweigart and Maureen Baginski the potential, and I think it was launched in 2002, to integrate public key infrastructure with EduRoam, which is a global hotspot Wi-Fi network that would give potentially evil teachers and radicalized students the ability to deploy to any crime scene before the crime occurs and engage in, let's say, social engineering. Maybe I could just send a message to our supporters. I think what they perhaps need to understand is we're up against a hugely powerful and well-resourced enemy, right, that I think is watching us as we close the gap between what the public perceives at a crime scene and what really happened.
Yeah.
And these people are getting, they're starting to flail, and they're getting very nervous. Now, as you know, David Zweigart wrote to Serco International in Virginia or wherever it is, right, alleging that we were engaged in tortious interference of Serco shareholders. Now, that's because he doesn't have a clue, this guy, but Serco International does not have shareholders because it's a wholly owned subsidiary of the Serco Group in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
And we're not engaged in tortious interference with Serco shareholders. What I think we're doing, and this is very important because they haven't reacted, we're warning Serco shareholders that if it is found that they had de facto custody of patented devices that caused the wrongful death of nearly 3,000 people on 9/11, they would be in the civil courts held liable, right? Whether it's negligence, reckless, willful, or fraudulent. So when Zweigart leads them into that trap, maybe because of his unique knowledge or his insider knowledge of public key infrastructure, I mean, the poor man, he calls his cat, was it Prepper Kitty Intel? I mean, what's wrong with him? I mean, the cat is an inoffensive little creature. I mean, we've seen it scudding across one of his videos. I mean, and what's with this guy, with his podgy little fingers waving over his egg and potato and sausages, right? I mean, doesn't he want to show himself? I don't know.
Well, I mean, again, he's very interested in presenting information in a way that allows him to deny it later. You know, when I've made reference to some of these videos in the court documents, he points out that I've broken the chain of custody by downloading his video and presenting it somewhere else. Is he saying that it's unclear if I've processed the video in some way and that it's a nullity? He's trying to prevent me from using that as evidence in the case because he is in the regular practice of spoliating the evidence, taking it down. I haven't taken any videos down from YouTube or elsewhere except for the cases where outside parties have forced me to take them down by putting strikes on, or YouTube has taken them down, or in the rare occurrence of a false start, some sort of technical glitch that causes the video to not contain any useful information. But even when we put out something that's incorrect or not accurate, we correct it and we leave it there so that there's an accurate record. Now, there's another interesting piece of evidence that's been spoliated, David, and I want to come back to this Amazing Polly video because, you know, she goes through quite a lot of detail in her video, and I really would encourage people to check out Amazing Polly and to subscribe to her channel and to watch this video. She talks about how there was some news reporting on, you know, she goes into great detail about Samantha Powers, and she's married to this guy, Cass, what's his name, who had this article talking about conspiracy theories. Cass, here he is. This guy's name, oh, David, are you still there? I think I just lost an electric circuit here. David, do I still have you? David? Oh, no. Well, something definitely just died in the hotel room here, and something's gone wrong. Let's see if we can get David back.
Listen?
David, have I got you back?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm not sure what was going on. I think some partial loss of power to part of the hotel room, but I think it's back. So what I was just telling everyone about is this Amazing Polly video where she's talking about the husband of Samantha Powers, this guy Cass Sunstein, who wrote this whole article about conspiracy theories and talking about, you know, I've spoken to someone on Crowdsource the Truth before about him, and Polly goes on to point out articles in the mainstream news that talk about victims, this Kieran Safritz, you know, people should really watch Polly's video, David, and I hope that you'll get a chance to watch it as well, because she does an amazing job of putting together all these clues that link this latest event to the Christchurch shooting and other major, you know, terrorist attacks, and she talks about how these messages are going out in newspapers and websites. And I mean, she's talking about steganography, something that you and I have spoken about quite a bit, something that's come up, of course, with the elimination or the editing or whatever of the word Mendenhall from the recent we've talked about it so many times, of course, this article that you originally brought to my attention, the 1979 article from the Washington Post, which clearly says Mendenhall's baby was due in early August. And we've got people now who are incredibly dedicated to scrubbing this Mendenhall word from the article. I am convinced it's a steganographic message to someone. The Amazing Polly video is talking about steganography surrounding all of these current events. I mean, David, I cannot shake the feeling that you and I each week are getting closer and closer to this very dangerous truth.
Yeah, and I think that this is absolutely critical. It's why we're provoking such hostility by these people. You notice that they have absolutely zero interest in working with us on solving the crime. You know, like 911 has got historical importance, great ramifications. Obviously, it was a network. The language that I find so offensive is, you know, with my background as an engineer, is you get dismissed as a conspiracy theory, but we know there was a conspiracy. There had to have been a conspiracy. The question is, who are the conspirators? We get the names of these conspirators injected by the BBC into our consciousness. You know, by the end of the day, the BBC had introduced probably the world's leading propaganda, news, and entertainment machine that's been going back since the 1920s, very sophisticated, and they inject the name Osama bin Laden, and by the end of the day, 200 million people around the world hear the name Osama bin Laden for the first time, and they basically can't get that out of their heads as he is the principal suspect. But of course, that was a conspiracy theory. So what we're doing is we're going back, raking over the coals and demonstrating by reverse engineering who injected that name. Well, you've got Alexander Haig, former Supreme Allied Commander Europe. He is interviewed on Fox News 2 minutes before the impact of the second plane. He's asked who does he think is behind it, and he comes up with this most extraordinary claim. Well, we know where to look. Well, first of all, he says, I'm not going to speculate because he doesn't have the information. Obviously, he does have the information because it's in the form of a script, which he helped to write. And he says, we know where to look. It's the Palestinians or bin Laden groups. Bingo. So that gets injected. It gets added through social engineering by people like Zweigert and so on. And they spread that word, and we come along, it's now, getting on for 20 years later when the greatest crime, not a terrorist act, but an organized criminal event that was staged, right, to look like a crime by some guy straddling a yak in a cave in Afghanistan. And let me just, before closing, could I mention about the British Telecom, or how much longer do we have?
Well, we're just about out of time, unfortunately, David, but you've brought up an interesting point about the script of these crimes, because, Mr. Zweigert also was pivotal in injecting this story that somehow I planned a bomb hoax in the port of Charleston. He's even written a book about it, and it's the entire basis for this Robert David Steele lawsuit and his own lawsuit. We've also seen a script of false information surrounding the Las Vegas shooting. Very clearly, that script has changed many, many times. Right. We're now seeing a script of false information. One of the key things that Amazing Polly brought out in her video is that there was an international network involved in this bombing in Sri Lanka. So I'm sorry to cut it a bit short, David, but we'll pick this up, of course, on Wednesday, and in May, hopefully, /crowdsource the truth or subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. I know there's an almost unending array of information that you want to share, David, but let's stop here for now, and we'll be back on Wednesday. And thank you again so much.